Hey there! Today I wanted to share with you how I made these vases with some recycled bottles and a little something called celluclay. Celluclay is a paper-based clay where you add water to it, sculpt with it, and then allow it to air dry. I love this stuff, but what I don't love is the waiting for it to dry before I can actually paint it. I also don't love painting on that scratchy surface. So recently I did an experiment where I attempted to make tinted clay with celluclay so that I could just forego the step of painting it, and it worked great. So I thought I would walk you through the process. When you're mixing up celluclay, as you can see, it's pretty dusty. I strongly recommend you do it outside. The first step is you're going to want to break up any large clumps of the paper-based clay. This is where you would normally add water, but for me, I decided to add some diluted acrylic paint. And really, honestly, truly, the only reason I used diluted acrylic paint is because those bottles were mostly empty and I needed to add water just to get the paint out of it. I mixed all that up, and as you can see, the stuff is pretty dry. For me personally, when I work with this clay, I like it to have the same kind of consistency and texture as kiln fire clay. As you can see, that was too dry, so I just went back, added a little bit of water, mixing it all together until I got it to the desired consistency. Now, since I wanted to make a bunch of different colors because I'm actually teaching a class with this stuff, I went ahead and mixed up tons of different colors of this clay with different kinds of acrylic paint. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the consistency that I like to work with the clay. Once I had this finished, I set it aside, rinsed out my bowl, washed my hands, and then went about mixing up more colors of clay. Again, I would recommend doing this outside, and of course, wouldn't you know, as I was in the middle of working on this, it started to rain, so eventually I did have to go inside. But like I said, it does help to have acrylic paint. You don't have to dilute it. I just found that I was running out of paint, and it really helped to get the last little bit of color out of the bottles. All right, so here I am back inside, and as you can see, it's pretty dusty stuff. So if you can't work outside, I would recommend wearing a mask and mixing up as many colors as you can if this is your plan. Now, I was pre-preparing all of these colors because, like I said, I'm teaching a class. But if you don't have time to do that, or if you're working with a class of students, part of the fun is actually mixing up this clay. So what you could do is give your students the opportunity to do just that. But anyway, here's the colors that I mixed up for the class I'm teaching tomorrow. I wrapped it all in plastic wrap and I'm keeping it in the fridge. It will keep in the refrigerator for up to a week before it starts to get a little either too hard or maybe kind of fuzzy, if you catch my drift. So that's something great to know, is that you can pre-prep all of your celluclay. But if you want to give your students the opportunity to do it on their own, here's how you can do that. You can give them like a little container to mix up the clay in, have them work in a smaller portion. You might want to have them use gloves because some of our students have sensory issues. Add that water and a little bit of acrylic paint, going for the consistency of kind of a kiln fire clay. So I've got this clay that I'm working and kind of massaging the water and the color into it to get it to the desired color and consistency. Now let's talk about how to cover the surface. I strongly recommend you use thick plastic bottles or glass bottles. Anything that's too thin under the weight of this clay might collapse. To add the clay to your armature or your surface, you're going to need to roll out a piece of clay that's about the size of a gumball, and then you're going to squish it and smash it onto the surface of your armature. When you squish it and smash it, you want to make sure that it's about as thick as a pancake or even thinner. And the reason I say that is because this clay tends to take a while to dry, and you don't want it to be drying forever. Sometimes I've noticed that if it takes too long to dry, it can actually start to mold. So I would recommend making sure that it's a consistent thickness and that thickness is about that of a thin pancake. And if you run out of clay like I did, then you can just continue and make some more. The only thing that's kind of tough is making sure that you get the correct color when you're making it. So it helps to make a large amount first. I decided I wanted to add some details onto my clay, like a handle. And if you're going to add things like a handle, you can see here I'm really taking the time to make sure to adhere the new piece to the old piece. I like to use the back of my fingernail to kind of anchor it in place. If you don't like doing that, I don't blame you, then you can get something like a skewer stick, but the key is to make sure that you've really smushed those two pieces of clay together. Otherwise, once the clay dries, it might stretch and pull apart from the base of the clay. Speaking of, when you're working with celluclay, normally when you're working with clay, you have to, like a kiln fire clay, you have to keep the clay wet at all times. So in between working on it, you have to wrap it up and keep it damp. That is not the same with celluclay, which is something that I absolutely love. You can let your clay project dry out completely before coming back and working on it again. So for example, if I had to stop, I could just set it and leave it on a shelf. It could be completely dry, and when I come back to work on it again and add damp clay to it, it will still adhere. So that's one of my favorite things about working with this clay. I added a little faux spout to that, and then I set it aside to let it dry. Now I'm going to try something a little bit different. Instead of just covering this and adding a funky handle, I wanted to add some details to it. So once again, as you can see, I am smushing that so it's about as thick as a pancake. And then I'm just going to cover this entire thing. Now I will say some little troubleshooting things you might want to keep in mind. Drying your clay piece completely in front of a fan will really prevent it from getting a little funky and moldy. So do that when you are completely finished with your piece. It does also help to rotate your piece so that it dries thoroughly all the way around. If parts of it dry ahead of other parts, for example, maybe the top dries before the bottom does, it could cause the clay to pull away and start to crack. So that's why getting it to dry consistently all over is pretty important. If things do fall off, for example, the handle, if it fell off, or a little design that I decided to add, you could of course glue it, or you could use the celluclay, the wet celluclay, as kind of a piece of glue to glue two pieces back together again. And if your clay does start to crack, don't worry about it, because you can always kind of fill in the crack with damp celluclay, or if you're going to be painting it later, probably the paint will fill in those gaps. So here I am covering up this bottle completely, and I'm going to add some designs to it. Now, I will tell you this, I did cover the bottle, I allowed it to dry, and then I decided to paint some designs that you are not going to be able to see very well, so it kind of defeated the purpose. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but if you see some little stripes right there, some pink stripes on my bottle, that's what that was. So that bottle is completely dry, and now I'm rolling out some coils with a different tinted clay. I will say this, that when I was rolling out these coils, I didn't realize until rewatching this video how much they look like worms. So there's that. So here I am making a whole bunch of worms. I wanted to add these little squiggles to the bottle, and instead of just making one and then adding it and doing it one at a time, I decided that I wanted them to be really consistent. So that's why I made all of them first. It did make the process a lot easier, and when I went to add them, I could just do it really quickly. When I was adding them, I made sure, once again, to really adhere both pieces together so that when it dries, it didn't fall off. So that meant smooshing the damp clay from the little squiggle onto the bottle. You'll see me do that again with my finger, but for you, you could use your finger or something like a skewer, anything that's going to help you smear that clay from one portion to the other. Now, when this was dry, I decided, actually, I didn't even have to let it dry in between. I wanted to add some polka dots to the clay, and pardon my giant head getting in the way, I just mixed up a brand new color of clay and added those little dots. I did have a couple of dots fall off this bottle, and again, I just reattached them when it was dry with an extra piece of celluclay. When my pieces were complete, I like this texture, but I was concerned that some of these parts of the bottle were going to continue to fall off. So I used Mod Podge. And I don't know if you can tell there's a tiny little bit of a shine there. There's Tika, say hello. But I did cover the entire thing with Mod Podge just to make sure each one of those pieces was really anchored on their well. Mod Podge comes in a bunch of different kinds of finishes. I used a satin to achieve this look. Anyway, guys, just wanted to share. You'll have to let me know if you make some of these, and have a good one. Toodles!